Hello everyone. It's been a while since our last mystery stories. So tonight I have a new one for you. I'm going to tell you about the Ninth Legion, a legion of the Roman Empire, that is to say, almost an entire army with thousands of men that surprisingly vanished from records in the 2nd century to not be ever written about again, as far as we know. And this is mysterious because the Romans left many archives and inscriptions and archaeological remains, which are as many historical records that allow to keep track of their history. We will see what a legion was, how they worked, and what may have happened to the Ninth Legion. Before we begin, I take this opportunity to tell you about a new podcast and YouTube channel that I just launched a few days ago. It's called Lights Out Library. You know, I have been on YouTube for years now, telling these stories. There are dozens on my channel, and I like crafting them, so I will absolutely continue to do it. But it is also limiting, in my opinion, to tell them with the ASMR label, with an accent, dubious English. I guess some of you also come for these particularities, and they are not going anywhere. It's not like I could eliminate them. But I also think there is a broader potential audience for relaxing stories or sleep stories, popularizing general knowledge outside the ASMR niche. So what I did was team up with a talented American editor and narrator, Sarah, to edit and retell the same stories and create a separate podcast and YouTube channel. We launched it a few days ago. It is already available on the main podcast platforms, which are probably going to be our main outlets. But there is a YouTube channel too. We have already several stories available, like about the history of piracy, fungi, the Odyssey, or Norse mythology. And the library is going to grow fast. We hope this kind of talks will reach more people, not necessarily you who listen to my channel, but of course you are most welcome to try it, maybe just for a change, or as daytime listening, or also as sleep aid if it works for you. If this new podcast and channel works, I also think of developing more versions with other people in different languages. You will find links in the video's description and the first comment pinned under the video. But for now, let's return to tonight's program. And before we begin, please take a moment to make yourself comfortable. Find a position you like, and do not hesitate to close your eyes whenever you want. My voice will guide you through this historical journey. There is probably tension in your shoulders that you can let go of. And when this is done, you can do the same with your arms, all the way to your hands and fingers. Breathe normally, and now do the same with your legs, all the way down to your feet. We are ready, so off we go. To begin with, why is the Ninth Legion at the center of a historical mystery? It disappeared, but so did all Roman legions eventually. This is not extraordinary by itself. What distinguishes this case is that the legion seems to have vanished from records, and this is highly unusual. The big picture of Roman history is rather well known, especially from the 2nd and 1st centuries BC to the 1st centuries of our era, because these were centuries of expansion and prosperity for the Romans, not without setbacks, civil wars and losses, but overall the Roman Republic and then the Roman Empire expanded, got wealthier, mightier, and produced a lot of archives, of monuments with inscriptions and other archaeological remains that make this period of antiquity relatively well known. Well known, but not without blind spots, especially in provinces of the Roman Empire that were far away from the center, from Italy. The main campaigns and battles were well recorded, especially when they were victorious. So is the political life in Rome and many provinces of the empire. We also have a lot of records of social, technical, religious, military aspects of ancient Rome. But far from the center, on the frontiers, or in lesser cities, there is often not that much information. So there are plenty of unknowns too, but nothing as big as the disappearance of an entire legion, of thousands of men. I will elaborate about what a Roman legion was in a minute. Before the Ninth Legion disappeared, there is sufficient information about it for more than 200 years, because this unit had a very long history. As a military unit, it was created probably at the beginning of the 1st century BC, that is to say around minus 90 years before the beginning of our era. Later, in 58 BC, so by the middle of the 1st century BC, it went under command of Julius Caesar when his career was on the rise. He was governor of the province of Cisalpine Gaul at the time, that is to say the north of Italy, and he used this region in an attack on the Helvetii, or Helvetians, a Celtic tribe that occupied part of modern Switzerland. This was the run-up to his campaign in Gaul, on the other side of the Alps. From there, the Ninth Legion traveled a lot. Of course, the initial soldiers that had formed the legion decades before had left or died long ago. Like a modern division, the legion maintained its headcount of fighters by regularly renewing them when they fell on battlefields or retired from the army. So it traveled to Greece and then to Africa, fighting for Caesar in the civil war that saw him take control of the Roman Republic in the following years. After his final victory, Caesar disbanded the legion, which was common at the time under the Roman Republic, because maintaining standing armies in times of relative peace was too costly. Legions were invasion and defense armies. Under the Roman Republic, they did not serve as a standing army to occupy provinces in the long run. So, temporarily, the Ninth Legion disappeared, but not for long. A few years later, Caesar's successor, Octavian, also named Augustus, one of the most prominent figures of Roman history, and the one that in practice turned the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. So Augustus recalled the veterans of the Ninth Legion to crush rebellions against his power. First in Sicily, then in Macedonia, and finally in his war against Mark Antony and Cleopatra. The Ninth Legion was involved on the side of Augustus, the victorious side, in the Battle of Actium, a massive naval battle off the coast of Greece that saw Augustus triumph over his rivals. After that, he pushed to Egypt and finished them, effectively taking control of Egypt and becoming the uncontested master of Rome. But this is another story. The Ninth Legion was then sent to Hispania, to the Iberian Peninsula, to finish the conquest. Spain had fallen under Roman control decades earlier, but there were still pockets of resistance. It was not fully pacified. The main resistance were the Cantabrians, a group of Celtic peoples that lived in the north of Spain, along the Atlantic coast, that corresponds to the modern regions of Cantabria, Asturias, and part of Leon. The Cantabrians were subdued with the help of the Ninth Legion around 19 BC. And in Spain, the legion gained the surname Hispana, after the province of Hispania. It remained often referred to as Legio Hispana in the 1st century AD and until its track was lost at the beginning of the 2nd century. And after that, it kept traveling, which shows how mobile Roman armies could be. They were sent wherever necessary, sometimes thousands of miles away, to ensure the defense of borders, to fight in civil wars, or in expansion campaigns. This time, the Ninth Legion was probably sent to campaign against Germanic tribes in the Rhine borderlands. Probably because records are not that affirmative here. What is more certain is that after this possible stop in Germany, it was sent to Pannonia, the name of an ancient Roman border province that was located south of the Danube River, in what is today parts of Hungary, Austria, Croatia, plus bits of Slovakia and Serbia. North of the Danube was an expanse in Central Europe that was dominated by Germanic tribes, which had themselves pushed away or mixed with the Celts. Rome would never be able to dominate this Germanic world, so these border provinces needed to be protected constantly in case of attacks or to prevent raids. But in the case of the Ninth Legion, it was relocated again to the other side of Europe in 43 AD, by the middle of the 1st century, to participate in the invasion of Britain led by Claudius, the ruling emperor. We don't know much about the actual involvement of the Ninth Legion in the conquest itself, but we know it was there because shortly after the conquest, it appeared amongst the provincial garrison. The conquest of Great Britain by the Romans was never finished. Parts of Wales and northern England kept resisting, even decades after they had been officially integrated within the borders of the empire. And to the north, Scotland was never really conquered. There were expeditions, but no durable occupation. So garrisons in the province were busy suppressing revolts and guarding frontiers, which remained the legion's function for the rest of the 1st century. We will go on with the history of the Ninth Legion until its trace was lost. And you will see that the Legion's history meets other important events, like the rebellion led by Queen Boudica. But before, let's take a look at what a Roman legion actually was. The term legion is famous because a legion was the largest military unit of the Roman army. If we compared it with modern armies, it could be called a division or a brigade depending on the countries. The size and organization varied over the centuries, but to give you an order of magnitude, a legion had 5,000 to 6,000 men at full capacity. It was conceived as a war machine that could be autonomous. It had its logistics, its commanders at different levels, and comprised smaller and smaller units that could act independently or coordinated. Among antique armies, this is certainly as far as any state ever went when it came to organization and discipline. The Roman legion reflected the taste of the Romans for efficacy through organization and standardization. We find this to a degree in all antique civilizations, but the Romans pushed it to an extreme when it came to their legions, and with spectacular results. When they fought on their frontiers against the Celts, the Germans, or different peoples of the Middle East and North Africa, battles often opposed the strictly aligned ranks of Roman soldiers with their standard equipment and geometrical formations to a much less disciplined mass of warriors with different weapons and no specialization on the other side. The Romans were not always victorious, and there were cases when the chaotic organization of the barbarians could be an advantage, especially outside of large conventional battlefields, for example in forests or mountains, where harassment tactics could be employed. But overall, the Roman war machine was rarely defeated in conventional battles or sieges for centuries, because it was very structured, organized. It did not disband easily. And obviously because Roman soldiers were trained and often seasoned. The legions were the backbones of this successful military. But they were not all of it. The legions were the empire's elite infantry. Elite because of their training, and social elite too, because only Roman citizens could join them. and these citizens paid for their equipment until the 2nd century BC under the Republic. This limited recruitment to reasonably wealthy citizens. This barrier of having to buy equipment was eliminated in the late 2nd century BC because the Republic faced manpower shortages for its legions. After that, the state paid for equipment. But recruitment in a legion was not open to everyone. The rest of Roman armies were the so-called auxiliaries, fighters who may or may not be citizens, but generally not, and these auxiliaries provided additional infantry and most of the cavalry in Roman armies. For most of the imperial period, the bulk of Roman armies was troops of auxiliaries rather than legions. Fighting as an auxiliary and being honorably discharged was a way of acquiring citizenship for people from around the Roman Empire. The status of citizenship is also something that's evolved over time. At the very start of the Roman Republic, it was limited to the city of Rome. Then it was extended to Italy and later to other provinces. But this status was always limited to a minority of people living within the borders of the empire. With citizenship came a number of rights, especially political rights, but also individual protections and social status, so it was desirable to non-citizens, obviously. Serving in the army was the best way to access citizenship. And for citizens, serving in a legion was also a way of social rise. It was demanding and dangerous, but veterans could receive land after their service. And in any case, they would be more respected in society after their years of service, if they survived them. It is unknown precisely when legions appeared, at least under the form they took at the time of Julius Caesar and Augustus, when Rome became an empire and expanded faster than ever. During the Republic, until the 1st century BC, legions were typically ephemeral. They were raised for specific campaigns and dissolved after, because of the cost of maintaining them, but also because of the risk of having an elite permanent army that could always be used by an ambitious general against republican institutions. The organization of legions was reformed several times, so it was not set in stone. But to take an example, if we look at the structure of a legion at the time of Julius Caesar, by the mid-1st century BC, the basic unit of soldiers was the centuria, the century, 100 men. Several of these centuries, generally 6, formed a cohort, and 10 cohorts formed a legion. Now the number of men in a century was initially 100, hence the name, but it was later reduced to 80 and still called a century. So one cohort of 6 centuries was 6 times 80, 480, and 10 cohorts were 4,800 legionaries. On top of them, there was a small cavalry force of a few hundreds attached to the legion, a cavalry force formed by wealthier citizens. They had to bring their horse along. This cavalry was used for pursuits, scouting, or surprise charges. It operated separately from auxiliary cavalry, which provided the numbers, and it remained attached to the legion. There were commanders at the different levels of the legion. A well-known rank was the centurion, that commanded a century, an equivalent to a captain in modern armies. And at the helm there was a general. In campaigns, several legions could be coordinated by a commander, like when Julius Caesar built his fame and prestige by conquering Gaul. He did it with an army of several legions plus auxiliaries. The size of legions, the number of men they comprised, increased at the start of the imperial period, and it approached 6,000 men. But later, in the last centuries of the Roman Empire, when it was in deep trouble, the name legion was kept for smaller units, 1,500 men or less, and there were more legions. So the golden age of the Roman legion, when there were imposing units with their dozens of centuries, was the 1st century BC to the 3rd century AD, just the time of the 9th legion. During this period, legions also became permanent. They were no longer dissolved, but instead they were stationed where they were needed and sent to participate in campaigns when necessary. There are legions that disappeared in this period and were not recreated. The worst example for the Romans was certainly the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in the year 9 AD. 3 entire legions, numbered 17th, 18th, and 19th, and their auxiliaries, were ambushed by an alliance of Germanic tribes. These Germanic warriors surprised the Romans dispersed, stretched on a long line of march, about 10 miles long, in a forest. That is to say, exactly the opposite of the environment that favored legions. They were not in formation, they could not maneuver, and centurions were cut from their chain of command. The Germans anticipated on the reaction of legionaries and their tactics, because one of their leaders had received a Roman military education. And with all these factors against them, the 3 legions were surprised and entirely destroyed. They were not recreated, and the disaster of Teutoburg ended Roman ambitions to invade Germania as they had planned. So these legions were lost, but we know why and how, because even though this disaster was a slap in the face for Rome, it marked the end of a period of very fast expansion that had begun with Augustus. This disaster was not ignored in archives. It was written about abundantly. An entire legion wiped out was a major event for the Roman Empire, a disaster that deserved to be reported, studied, and avenged if possible. Which brings us back to the 9th legion. Because it disappeared, but we have no such record, as if no one had had interest in the loss of thousands of legionaries, who were also citizens, not common men from auxiliary troops. Now, let's return to the story of the Ninth Legion, where we left it. We left the legion in Britain after the conquest by Emperor Claudius in 43 AD. And I told you that in the following decades, the legion remained stationed there as garrison. Garrison didn't mean it was peaceful. As we saw before, there were revolts and uprisings inside the frontiers and beyond them. And in the following decades, the Ninth Legion was engaged regularly. The Roman Empire had expanded in Britain, annexing the territories of various Celtic tribes, and it intended to do what it had already done in the north of Italy, in Spain or in France, integrating these Celts by Romanizing them, not necessarily by erasing their culture, but by imposing its laws, its social organization, its administration, the use of Latin, at least for elites and administration. But for many years, the Celts resisted this. In 50 AD, so that's 7 years after the invasion, there was an uprising led by a Celt king, a Celt chieftain, called Caratacus, the chief of the Catuvelloni tribe, a Celtic tribe from the southeast of England. 2 legions, including the Ninth, were sent to crush it, which they did. Also in the same decade, the legion was sent to the north of England to fight another native revolt, that of the Brigantes, led by their king, Venutius. The territory of the Brigantes was approximately in the region that would become Yorkshire. These revolts were controlled, but a more serious one was about to burst. In the years 60 and 61, 17 years after the conquest, the rebellion of Boudica. Boudica was a queen of the Iceni tribe from the east of England, in present-day Norfolk. When the Romans had arrived to Britain, they had exploited the feuds between tribes, allying with some of them to defeat others. They had already done the same almost a century before in Gaul. The fragmentation and rivalries between tribes had been a huge advantage for the Romans in this conquest. The king of the Iceni, the husband of Boudica, had entered an alliance with the Romans, and as an ally, he had been allowed to keep his land as a nominally independent small kingdom. And he had left a will in which he left his kingdom jointly to his 2 daughters, his daughters with Boudica, and to the Roman emperor. He was trying to preserve some independence, at least officially, so that his family, his offspring, would not lose the throne. But when he died, the Romans just ignored his will, and they proceeded to annex his kingdom and take his property. This was a common way of expanding for the Romans, and it happened in different parts of their empire. They allied with neighboring kingdoms, and this was the first step towards annexation a few years or decades later. So Boudica and her daughters were spoliated of what they considered to be their rights. But instead of letting it go, the queen organized an uprising of the Iceni, and she was joined by other tribes that also rejected Roman rule. Her troops marched on the city of Camulodunum in Essex, present-day Colchester, and they destroyed it. Camulodunum was previously the capital of another tribe, but the Romans had turned it into a colonia. A colonia, that is to say, a settlement in newly conquered Roman territory that served to distribute land to discharged legionaries. I told you about that before. Legionaries were given land to establish themselves after their service. And what better option than give them conquered land? This meets the second function of a colonia, which was to Romanize a new province. The laws, the language, and the urbanism of a colonia were purely Roman. So a new colonia served as a beacon of Roman influence in a new province. Destroying Camulodunum was a clear sign of rejection of Roman order. Camulodunum was a resounding victory for Boudica, and the Britons she led. Significant Roman forces sent to stop her had been defeated, including the 9th Legion, which had never suffered such a defeat in its already long history. Most of its foot soldiers were killed in battle as they tried to relieve the besieged city. The legion was almost wiped out, only its cavalry escaped. But it did not disappear. It was reinforced with new legionaries, coming especially from the provinces of Germania, that were sent to Britannia in the following years. In the year 61, the situation now looked very serious for the Romans, because after the destruction of Camulodunum and a big part of their forces in Britain, Boudica was now marching on Londinium, the capital of Roman Britain. Londinium was a Roman settlement established during or shortly after the invasion, on the current site of the city of London. The settlement was still small. It was less than 20 years old back then in 61, and it appeared that it was not going to be defensible because Roman forces had been routed at Camulodunum. A detachment of what remained of the 9th Legion tried to stop Boudica's forces, but was beaten again. And Londinium was captured and burnt to the ground, another heavy symbol of rejection of the Romans. At this point, the situation was critical, and it seems the emperor, Nero at the time, who had succeeded Claudius, considered a complete withdrawal from Britain, which was a source of problems. And being at the margin of the empire, without resources that the Romans really needed, it had turned into a headache, a costly one, that did not feel that necessary. Except a withdrawal would have been humiliating, and the Romans did not use to evacuate when they had conquered provinces. A last chance attempt was tried. The governor, Suetonius, regrouped his forces, including the remnants of the 9th Legion, and confronted the Britons. The Romans were outnumbered, because as Boudica advanced, she had gained followers from different tribes that joined her rebellion. We don't exactly know how many there were in her army, but possibly more than 200,000. A huge force even though it was not very organized nor well equipped probably. But it was a multiple of the number of Roman soldiers that stayed at this point in Britain. But the Romans were motivated because the Britons took no prisoners. They executed everyone they captured, including Roman civilians, so it was victory or death for them. They managed to obtain a confrontation on favorable terrain. In a pass between hills with a wood behind that strongly reduced the Britons' numerical advantage. And their discipline and superior equipment did the rest. They advanced in wedge formation, they could deploy their cavalry, and against the odds, the Romans won. Boudicca's army disbanded, many of her men were lost, and the Romans pushed their advantage to recover control of everything they had lost. Roman Britain was saved, at least for now. Boudicca died shortly after. We don't know if it was by suicide or due to illness. But with her died this attempt to expel the Romans from Britain, one of the most threatening rebellions the Romans had had to face across their empire. The figure of Boudicca remains widely famous in the UK, because 15 centuries later, during the Renaissance, her rebellion against the Romans became a highlight of British ancient history. This culminated in the 19th century, during the Victorian period, when she became a cultural figure and a kind of national heroine. The same process appeared in different European countries in modern times, as they were affirming their specificity as nations and establishing a national history. They needed figures that appeared pre-Roman and pre-Christian ideally, to establish roots that started far back and could symbolize national independence. In Great Britain, Boudicca became one of them. In France, an equivalent is Vercingetorix, a Celt chieftain. Vercingetorix had led a coalition of Celtic tribes against the Roman invasion of Julius Caesar. Like Boudicca, he had had initial successes repelling the Romans before losing it all. Both had tragic destinies and ultimately lost, but they put up a fight. So they were adopted as cultural figures and national heroes, even though in both cases we know very little about their character. Returning to the Ninth Legion, we saw that it had been almost destroyed during Boudicca's rebellion and saved in extremis by the successful Roman pushback. We know it was reinforced and sent again to the north of England, where in the years 70, 10 years after Boudicca, they fought another campaign against the Brigantes in Yorkshire. Stamps on tiles found in York tell us that the Ninth Legion built a fort in the city in those years. By the years 70 and 80, Roman control over England had finally strengthened. It was still not fully peaceful like other West European provinces, but the risk of a large-scale rebellion seemed now to be behind them. Romanization was advancing, and to the Britons, like other peoples before them, it was appealing. It brought a certain prosperity, exotic products arriving from the continent, better agricultural yields, so less food problems. It had ended the cycle of wars between rival tribes, and native elites had increasingly embraced the Roman rule. But to the north, Scotland was still independent. In the years 82-83, so we were now 40 years after the invasion and 20 years after Boudicca's rebellion, a general and politician named Agricola led an invasion of Scotland. The Romans called Scotland Caledonia, actually not necessarily all of Scotland. For them, Caledonia was the northern half of Scotland, north of the River Forth. But sometimes they used the term Caledonia for everything north of Roman Britain. And later, the term Caledonia also came to name all of Scotland as a romantic or poetic name. The Romans managed to invade Scotland, Caledonia, but never to control it. It remained outside the administration of Roman Britain and could not be pacified. The Ninth Legion participated in the 82-83 invasion, and according to Tacitus, who was a Roman historian, it narrowly avoided destruction again in Scotland, in an ambush by the Caledonians. Their camp was attacked at night, and the Scots surprised the legion in its sleep. Hand-to-hand fighting ensued, and the legion was saved by relief cavalry sent by Agricola. Caledonians were pushed back. The detail of the legion's operations in Scotland is not very well known, but 25 years later, the legion was still in the north of England. There is evidence that it was stationed in York in the year 108. This was written on a stone tablet found in York. And after 108, nothing, at least nothing in Britain. No other known record across the entire Roman Empire indicates that the region would have moved to another part of Britain. But inscriptions found in the Netherlands, on the site of a fortress that corresponds to modern Nijmegen, suggest that the Ninth Legion could have been relocated there. However, this is not fully conclusive, for two reasons. First, because it could have been just a detachment of the Ninth Legion. A British detachment is attested at Nijmegen in this period, the first decades of the 2nd century. But we don't know whether the entire legion was sent there, or if it was a mix of various units based in Britannia to reinforce defenses against Germanic tribes. A second reason is the nature of these remains found in the Netherlands. There are tile stamps, part of a military medal, and an altar to god Apollo that belonged most probably to members of the legion. There are inscriptions on them that indicate this. But it doesn't mean the legion as a whole was there. It could have been just survivors relocated to other units and sent to the Netherlands. These finds in the Netherlands have been dated to around the year 120. After that, there is no other record of the legion anywhere. But we know it ceased to exist at some point, because there is an exhaustive list of the existing Roman legions dated from the year 197 77 years later. In this list, 33 legions are listed, and there is no trace of the ninth. So it appears that the legion disappeared at some point between 108 in Yorkshire or 120 in the Netherlands and 197. But no record of battle indicates that it was destroyed. And this is puzzling, because the 2nd century is not a dark age or a time of big disruption for the Roman Empire. It's just the opposite. This period is generally considered to be a peak for Rome, a time when for decades civil wars were avoided, the empire expanded and got stronger and more prosperous. It built a lot and produced an abundance of inscriptions, chronicles, and archaeological remains. So what happened to the Ninth Legion? How could a military unit with thousands of men, thousands of citizens, including from wealthy and influential families, how could it disappear apparently unnoticed, or at least unreported? A traditional theory was that indeed it was weird that the legion disappeared like this, but that it had probably been destroyed in the north of England, where it was stationed at the beginning of the 2nd century. This theory dominated before the discovery of the inscriptions suggesting that all or parts of the legion could have been in the Netherlands around 120. But as I was telling you, this discovery in the Netherlands is a clue rather than a proof. It probably proves that some people who belonged to the Ninth Legion at the very beginning of the 2nd century happened to be in the Netherlands around the year 120. It doesn't prove that the entire unit was there. And for this reason, this traditional theory could well be a possibility, at least to explain how part of the legion disappeared. The last trace of the Ninth Legion in Britain is dated to 108, and we know that at the time, around 108, the northern frontier of Roman Britain, the frontier with Caledonia, Scotland, was not peaceful at all. The Caledonians were hostile on the other side, and Yorkshire, the land of the Brigantes, may still have been rebellious. The Brigantes may have revolted again after 108 and destroyed the legion. What gives support to this hypothesis is that various Roman sources of the 2nd century agree that keeping the Britons under control was nearly impossible at the start of the 2nd century. Around 122 AD, the Emperor Hadrian visited Britain and launched the construction of Hadrian's Wall to protect the northern frontier of Roman Britain from the Caledonians. There is no contemporary record of a military disaster in Yorkshire around these years, which is bizarre if it happened. But on the other hand, such a disaster could be a plausible explanation for the decision to build Hadrian's Wall. Of course, the Romans preferred to retell and write about their victories, but their writings do not shy away from setbacks, from defeats. So the idea that the legion was wiped out and that no one cared enough to write about it would be really unusual. Legions at the time, in the 2nd century, were also never disbanded. when they were no longer needed somewhere, they were relocated somewhere else, not eliminated like at the time of the Republic. And this, the hypothesis of a relocation, plus the discoveries in the Netherlands about the presence of the legions or part of it, made this first explanation fall out of favor with some historians. But others continue to think that destruction in Britain is the most likely scenario, and that it could have happened in the years 110 or 120, before Hadrian's visit and the construction of the wall. The supporters of this theory also argue that involvement somewhere else is not backed by any evidence. The inscriptions and personal belongings found in the Netherlands only indicate that maybe part of the legion was there. But as I said before, what if it were just a few veterans, survivors, reallocated there after the destruction of the legion? It is not totally conclusive evidence that the whole legion was sent to the continent. Scholars inclined to believe in the theory of destruction in Britain acknowledge that it is very unusual not to have records of this disaster. But it doesn't mean it is impossible. There could have been a series of coincidences that made them all disappear. Or they exist and have not been found yet. But still, the hypothesis that the legion had maybe not been destroyed in Britain led to other theories. It is established that it no longer existed in 197. So something had to happen between at least 120 and 197. If the legion had been relocated in the meantime, it could have disappeared in another conflict. And maybe even it could have been the withdrawal of the 9th Legion from Yorkshire that led to the troubles in northern England before Hadrian's visit. Two conflicts of the 2nd century, where the legion could have disappeared, deserve our attention, because each of them provides a hypothesis that has some merits. The first one is the Jewish revolt that broke out in Judea in the year 132. Judea was at the opposite corner of the Roman Empire, but it is plausible that a legion would be redeployed so far from its previous assignment. You remember the 9th Legion traveled a lot in the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. Italy, Greece, Africa, Spain, Britain. So why not Judea? Because in the 1st and 2nd centuries, this province was another troublesome one. The Romans had established a large military presence there in the 1st century, but the Jews resisted Romanization and occupation, which led to several revolts that were repressed. The revolt of 132 was the third major one since Roman occupation. It was led by Simon Bar Kokhba, a Jewish military leader, and he was rather successful at first. He managed to establish an independent state in Judea for 3 years, effectively eliminating Roman rule in the land he controlled, which was much of the province. This meant that the Romans had to reconquer their province. Emperor Hadrian assembled a large army from across the empire. This is a point that makes the theory that the 9th Legion was sent there plausible, even though it is not backed by any known document. It took 6 legions, plus auxiliaries, plus elements from several other legions, to finally crush the revolt and reconquer Judea. This long rebellion, or war, had disastrous effects. For the Romans, there were heavy casualties. It is not impossible that a legion engaged in this conflict could have disappeared. But the worst was for the Jews. Between the reconquest and then the retaliation, Judea was significantly depopulated, as many Jews were killed or expelled, to the point that some historians see this revolt, the years 132 to 136, as the moment when the Jews became a minority in the land of Israel. Others date it to a later period of the Roman or Byzantine Empire. But in any case, there is no doubt that the Bar Kokhba uprising ended terribly for the Jews and left deep scars, starting with increased persecutions against them all across the Roman Empire. Bar Kokhba doesn't have a good name in Jewish historiography. He seemed to have been quite exhilarated. He presented himself as a messiah, sent to guide his people. But ultimately, he led the Jews to disaster and was regarded as a false messiah. So, did the Ninth Legion disappear in Judea? Maybe, but this is purely speculative. There is no known exhaustive listing of the troops that were sent to Judea that could answer this. It is possible that, given the quantity of troops sent to Judea, one of the units would not be mentioned anywhere. But this is no proof. It could also be argued that a disaster in Britain, not recorded anywhere, is mysterious and unlikely. But the sending of a legion to the other side of the empire and its destruction there that would also not leave any trace is even more unlikely. Another reason for the Judean theory is that another legion, the 22nd, also disappeared from records in the same period. The 22nd Legion was based in Egypt, and it was engaged in Judea. It is documented in the province at this period, and after the conflict it disappears from records. So it is believed that the 22nd Legion was destroyed in Judea. If it happened to it, why not to the 9th too? But as we saw, this is pure speculation. A second alternative theory to the destruction in Britain is that the 9th Legion disappeared somewhere in Cappadocia, not in the years 130, but later, in the years 160. And why is that? East of the Roman provinces of the Middle East, Judea, Syria, Anatolia in modern Turkey, was Rome's most formidable enemy, the Parthian Empire. The two states were either at war or in periods of armed peace for a long time, none of them able to durably dominate the other in the region. There was an open war in the years 161 to 166 under Emperor Marcus Aurelius in Rome and King Vologases IV in the Parthian Empire. During this war, a legion was surrounded and destroyed in Cappadocia, in modern Turkey. An unspecified legion. And here there is something a bit weird, because there were two legions permanently stationed in Cappadocia, the 12th and the 15th legions. These two legions keep appearing in records well after this battle, including in the 3rd century. So none of them was destroyed, and it must have been another one, sent as reinforcement or in transit in Cappadocia. But we don't know which one. Why not the 9th Legion? But here again, there is no proof of this, and it could perfectly be another one. Some historians think it could even be the 22nd, this legion stationed in Egypt, that disappeared from records after the time of the rebellion in Judea. I told you earlier it was assumed to have been destroyed in Judea. But what if it wasn't, and was eliminated instead 30 years later in Cappadocia? This remains a question mark, and a possible explanation for the disappearance of the 9th Legion. But as there is zero evidence, it is also just speculation. And in a sense it sounds even less likely than a disappearance in Judea, because we would have to assume that the 9th Legion continued to exist for more than 50 years after its last traces in England, that it travelled, was engaged in battles, and finally disappeared in modern Turkey without leaving a single known trace anywhere for half a century. And this is where we are today. It is not that the mystery of the 9th Legion is unexplainable. There are different possibilities that are plausible. But we don't know with certainty which one it is. Maybe the most likely explanation remains that the 9th Legion met its destruction in the north of England, in a poorly documented uprising of peoples from the region, the Brigantes in Yorkshire, and or other tribes from Scotland who crossed the border at a time when Hadrian's Wall did not exist yet. We would have to accept that accounts of its destruction were lost, or that for some reason the news did not travel the Roman Empire, and was not much written about or commented. Strange, very unusual, but technically not impossible. From there, a few survivors may have been relocated to other units, explaining the belongings found in the Netherlands. Or, if the Legion did not disappear in Britain, it could have been sent elsewhere and have disappeared. But it remains in a sense less likely, because as I said earlier, the 2nd century had its challenges for the Roman Empire, but it was a rather stable and prosperous period for a majority of provinces, really not a time of chaos during which track of large military units could be easily lost. The story of the 9th Legion remains probably more known in the UK than elsewhere, because it stationed there for decades and was a significant part of the history of Roman Britain, being engaged in the initial conquest, and then the revolt of Boudica and other rebellions, as well as expeditions to Scotland. Maybe future archaeological finds in Britain or elsewhere will bring an answer to this disappearance. For now, the mystery lives on. we have reached the end of our journey for tonight. I hope you liked it and could learn a few things about ancient Rome along the way. I'll be back soon with another story. And in the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams. Au revoir.